Thank you very much for coming to our new BIM Talk. Today's guest is Medina Jordan, and she has extensive experience in asset and FM management. So when we say FM, we refer to facilities management. We will talk a little bit about digital twins. We will talk about capturing valuable data and how to use that data. We'll talk about standards for BIM, like ISO 19650, and standard for asset management and asset like facilities management, which is 55000 by ISO. So there will be also a lot of advices going from Medina based on her experience, and we'll also have do's and don'ts about the BIM. So there is lots of things to communicate, lots of things to share. Stay until the end so you can get most out of it. In the end of this session, we will also have a live Q&A. So we will be looking for your questions, and Medina and I would love to answer your questions. Therefore, stay until the end so you can get all your questions answered. So today's guest is, as I said, Medina. I would like to welcome her and say, hi, Medina. How are you doing?
Hi, Hassan. Nice to meet you. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you very much. So can you tell us a little bit about your background so people know a little bit with who they are talking to?
Yes, I actually have a very unconventional background into facilities management. I'm a trained scientist. I have a doctorate in marine science. And as part of my PhD, I developed a lot of transferable skills, which covered research, sampling, experimental design, process development, and then comes the data bit. So it's data collection, data processing, data analytics. And it was during the course of my research that I really started to appreciate the value of data. When you have good quality data, and if it's analyzed appropriately, it can tell such meaningful stories that can help businesses. So after I completed my PhD, I decided not to continue in academia. I wanted to have a business career where I could use as many transferable skills as possible, particularly the data analyst side of things. And so actually, while I was completing my PhD thesis, I joined a construction company called Skanska, and I ended up staying there for 14 years.
Wow.
And the last 8 years being in the facilities management division. I was initially seconded into the department with the initial remit of analysing the huge volumes of asset information they were capturing on their projects when the buildings are in the operational phase. But my role quickly evolved into being a BIM lead. And then I had 2 other hats added on to me, which was leading the business in analytics and also promoting strategic asset management. And the reason why I stayed in the FM division for 8 years was because I'm somebody that likes to see projects through to completion. I actually get a buzz out of seeing the project from the inception all the way through to the end. The 8 years didn't come without its challenges, that's for sure. But I actually got good satisfaction in seeing the business where the data wasn't of great quality through to really good quality asset information being captured, where we could start doing really sophisticated analytics, and then started to move into the strategic asset management area.
Wow, that's quite interesting. And can you zoom in a little bit on the part where you started the first BIM lead? How did it happen? Is it like there was an opportunity for that job position and you were right fit, or how did it work exactly?
That was a very strange one. And it was as simple as one lunchtime, I'm doing my work at my desk. I bear in mind that this is my first time in facilities management, so I'm having to learn about what facilities management is. And I happened to pass the then MD's desk, and he just stopped me and he said, Medina, have you heard of BIM? And I said to him, what is BIM? And he said, well, get learning because you're now the BIM lead for the business. That's exactly how it went.
Wow. And Skanska is like a large scale company, extremely large. So
very large, yes.
So how come they didn't have, they didn't tend to hire someone that has more expertise, and they were like trying to get a BIM lead from scratch because you had the potential of leadership? Or is it because you were keen to learn on the facility management and they want to take it to the next level and you were right fit from their point of view?
Right, so we have to go back to 2009, where BIM started to really take off in the UK. And BIM at that time was being embraced wholeheartedly by the design teams and the construction teams. But Skanska as a whole wanted to adopt BIM across all of its divisions, including the facilities management division. I think the MD at the time understood that BIM was linked to information management. And I was brought into the FM division with the initial remit of analysing the asset
Okay.
information. And that's where I believe he saw the link. I didn't see the link at the time because I didn't understand what BIM was. And it took a while for me to sit in on meetings. And there was difficulties because every meeting was geared towards what BIM could do for design teams and construction teams. And it took quite a while for me to understand, well, where does facilities management fit? How does BIM fit in with facilities management? And I finally got the light bulb moment where I kind of focused on the I of BIM, the information management bit of BIM. And that's when I realized actually within the facilities management business, there was an issue with the quality of asset information that was being handed over to them from construction teams to the facilities management teams. And that's where I understood actually, if I could find a way of using BIM to correct the quality of the information being handed over, this is my hook into BIM. This is how I can sell BIM within the facilities management business. And I've stuck with that ever since. For
Okay.
me, BIM is, for me, it's all about the information, the
It
management
is.
of information. And I had to spend a long time dispelling the myth within the facilities management teams, because whenever I mentioned BIM, oh, it's 3D modeling. No disrespect to 3D modeling, but I had to say it's not just 3D modeling, it's not just technology. Please focus on the information aspect. This is what
That's
this is
correct.
what this is what the FM teams need. At the end of the day, a 3D model is a really nice to have, but actually what we really need as a fundamental is good quality asset information handed over to us. And that was actually my hook. And that's how I applied being within the business.
I think this is a very interesting talk. We will, in a second, we will jump into understanding more BIM for facility management and what are the benefits. But before that, I would like to make just a couple of points there. When you said information management, there's a huge misconception in the industry, and I agree with you. People tend to think about BIM as a model or modeling side, but there is three levels to that. There is a BIM building information model, very graphical, non-graphical, and documentation that is captured. But there's a modeling, a process to capture that, and there's a management part. So if they're missing these two things, the process and the management side, they are either doing over modeling or they're doing under modeling. Modeling, I mean, again, graphical, non-graphical, and documentation, meaning it could be just data as well. So if they're delivering an unusable data or a data that is not relevant, it loses the whole point and you actually limit the maximum potential of BIM. And that's very sad. And in fact, the idea is to get a maximum potential from the traditional workflows, which you can actually make it worse than the traditional workflow if you're just constantly capturing wrong data or following the wrong path.
That's exactly right. And that was my reason for being within the in the FM division. The issue that the business had at the time was the quality of asset information being handed over to them. And it was affecting all elements of operational activities in the business. And the root cause of that issue was the data was inconsistent. The data was incomplete. The data sometimes wasn't relevant. It wasn't in the right format. There was non-standardization of the data being handed over. We saw non-standardization of asset information within a
Oh my
single
God.
project. And so when I was brought into the business originally, my first remit was, Medina, because of your data analysis background, we are tasking you to analyze the asset information that's being captured to see where we can improve asset reliability. But when I did a review of the asset information being captured, I had to go back to the then MD and say, actually, I can't do my job because I can't even do any basic comparisons within a single project, let alone comparing one project to another, because there was no consistency of the asset information. And that's the reason why we had to basically create a brand new asset information management platform. And I used the BIM framework to achieve that.
Okay, when you say platform, did you use some kind of software, or was it just solely like a bunch of combination of documentation and software and standardization?
Right. It was right back to basics in terms of defining a suite of new asset information standards, internal standards within the business. So that covered a standard format of the asset register with far more data fields that the FM teams were used to, and also far more data fields that the construction teams were used to completing and handing over. A standard way of categorizing the assets, a standard way of uniquely coding the assets, a standard way of uniquely tagging the assets out on site, and a few other things as well. And then we also had an issue within the business of we have a core technology in the system in the business called CAFM, Computer Aided Facilities Management. It's what's used to store the asset register that's handed over by the construction teams. It's used as a means of scheduling maintenance tasks for the engineers. And it's also used to capture help desk calls by occupants in a building to say, there's a problem with this room, it's either too hot or too cold. And that allows the maintenance engineers to go out and check. And if it's an asset related issue, that maintenance event can be linked right back to the asset. So that's our core technology that's used in FM operational activities. At the time, not only was there non-standardization of the asset information, there was also a non-standardization of the CAFM system. So we had about 10 different CAFM systems
Wow.
configured in different ways across the portfolio of projects, which again meant that I couldn't do my job because I couldn't do basic analytics because I couldn't compare apples with apples. And so the new asset information management platform not only included developing a suite of asset information standards, but it also included selecting a new core CAFM system, one CAFM system, rolled that out on all new projects, retrospectively deployed them on existing projects, but also implemented a standard configuration of that system so that it was aligned with the data standards that had been developed. That was the new asset information platform that was developed. Plus, you had all the new processes that went along with that, because it was a complete change to the way people were traditionally working.
Actually, I think the conversation is going very well because we first talk about the pain point, where the pain point of the FM and asset management industry was with the BIM data, or like instead of BIM data, I will just call data. And then now we will just talk about a little about going information management and how you like use the benefits. So can you tell a little bit more about like the benefits of using proper BIM workflow with in a proper process, standard in place, so where you can use the data efficiently?
Oh, there were so many benefits once we developed this new standard. So first of all, because I was working in a BIM framework, once we defined our information standards within the FM division, obviously there was a lot of training, there was a lot of awareness, there were a lot of changes to existing ways of working. But once we had agreed and set out what these new standards were, because I was the BIM lead, I then had the opportunity to work with the corporate BIM team at Skanska and also work with individual design and construction teams to communicate our new information standards. We were then able to say right at the start of a project, this is the level of information that we need to be handed over to us in order for us to smoothly transition from construction phase into operations phase. And it was a bit of a shock to the system, to the design and construction teams, because they saw the level of information that we now wanted. But then it was an opportunity for me to kind of educate them about what facilities management was and why we needed this level of information. So that collaboration was really, really helpful. They got to learn more about what we did in the operations phase of the building life cycle. I actually got to learn more about what they do at the design phase and the construction phase. But it meant that when, especially on a design, build and operate project, we were confident about the quality of information that was being handed over. Because we had communicated our requirements, that information was now included in the BIM information exchange plans. And we were able to get drafts of what the information was looking like. And if there was any kind of issues, we can always go back to them and again, re-communicate our information requirements. At handover, we received a much, much better quality of asset information, and it was consistent this time. It was at the right level of detail, at the right level of granularity, in the right format. We received it promptly, and that allowed a smooth transition from when a project is constructed through to when a building is actually being occupied and operated. From there, because of the quality of that information, it allowed maintenance teams to actually add additional information to that base asset information that we received. They were then able to connect the history about how the asset was performing. So maintenance events could be linked directly back to an asset. Breakdown events, which naturally occur, could be connected directly to an asset. And that then would allow asset management teams who are responsible for generating the rolling 1 year and 5 year asset management lifecycle strategies. They had such good body of data, they were able to come up with more robust strategies and more justified strategies because the information quality was so good.
Absolutely. And one thing I would like to penetrate here, I would like to ask, when you had those challenges in the beginning that information was really bad, and you put the standards in place, and then the information quality went up, because it might be good to for our audience to understand, asset management team, at which stage of the project before it's constructed kicked in? Can you tell a little bit about that?
Actually, it will kick in sometimes at the beginning because they will feed information at the beginning of a project. I mean, the purpose of BIM is also to have a feedback loop. So to feed in what went well on a project to feed into a new project. And that could be the performance of an asset from a particular manufacturer, so that when it comes down to the procurement phase within that project, you know, the FM teams and the asset management teams can actually provide, you know, useful advice to say, an air handling unit, for example, you're planning to procure this air handling unit from this particular manufacturer, but experience during the operational phase has shown us that the quality isn't very good. The cost of maintenance is too high when you compare it with how many breakdowns it has. So as that information, the asset management team can actually use that to feed back to designers or the people responsible for procurement to say, we actually recommend that you choose an air handling unit from a different manufacturer because it might cost more upfront, but the operational costs will be a lot cheaper.
It is the whole life cycle, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was actually quite passionate about that. And that's the reason why I really enjoy collaborating with the asset management teams to understand their requirements and their issues, which was fairly similar actually to the FM teams. They just were working in silos. And what BIM also allowed was for us to collaborate more for each project team, the design team, the construction team, the FM teams, and the asset management teams. They had a framework to collaborate better with each other, to understand what they each did, their dependencies on each other, and they all appreciated the value of asset information as it goes through the building life cycle.
Okay, that actually gives a kind of a workflow between, because you are involved in the beginning of the project, I would say throughout the project life cycle, so you know what end product you're going to get. And when you were at the beginning, were you using some kind of tools? I would say, like there are lots of like new tools. I don't want to give exactly names right now, but there are tools for like asset information models and asset requirements. So did you use any kind of this, like to guide what kind of requirements do you have? So in the end of the day, but not only from the standard point of view, but at the end of the day, like from the asset point of view, like what kind of, because like if I look back to the traditional workflows, what happens with the traditional workflow is that generally architect comes up with the design and then everyone goes around that design, but the design might cost much more than the budget of the developers. So then this becomes a whole of an issue. Then they have to revert back, make some shortcuts with the design. Design becomes really bad, just bad because the initial design was a good idea and very well like a concept. But when you start shortcutting like a lot of things, chopping a lot of things, it doesn't become anymore a good design. But if actually the designer or the actual concept went through directly with the asset information and asset requirements, then they would have actually rounded and wrapped their design around that. So they would limit to certain things, and the quality and the actual design would have been really, really much higher. So were you involved in this kind of workflow?
Right. So two things actually. At the beginning, back in 2009, we weren't aware of any such software. So within the FM team, I had to do some reverse engineering actually. Once I realized that the quality of the asset data wasn't good enough, that it wasn't benefiting the FM teams, the asset management teams, it wasn't helping me with doing any analytics. And when I had to create a new asset information management platform, we didn't have software to define what those asset information requirements were. I literally had to do manual reverse engineering where, based on my discussions with the operational senior management and the asset management teams, it was to try and define at a really high level what the organizational requirements were, which kind of helped because I was new to facilities management. I was quite comfortable to ask all of the basic questions. What information do you need to smoothly mobilize a project from construction through to operations phase? What information do you need to generate as much value out of that asset as possible? And from there, once there was agreement as to the level of information required, I then went backwards to say, okay, in order to generate that information, what data do I need? And then I checked to see across the portfolio whether this data was being collected. In some cases it was, and in other cases not at all. And it was from there that I created the standards. I knew that we couldn't capture all of the requirements. Businesses evolve, so they always find new pieces of information that will benefit them. But I allowed the platform to have a degree of scalability so that if there was new information that the business would benefit from, then the system could be scaled up to capture new data points to generate that new information. So we started with a broad brush of these are the typical information requirements, asset information requirements that will benefit FM teams, that will benefit asset management teams, that will benefit people that love analytics like myself. And then I had to verbally communicate that to the design team and the construction team. We held workshops with the design and construction teams on different projects to say, this is why we need this level of data. I'll give you one example. I remember somebody asking, why do you need to know the location of an asset in a building? Why do you need that information in the asset register? And for me, I was like, Well, I think it's quite straightforward, but let me explain. Maintenance engineers need to know where to go to find the asset that needs to be maintained. Maintenance engineers need to know where to go if the asset has broken down. Therefore, we need to have location. We need to know where you have installed that asset in the building. It's as simple as that. But because they weren't working with a FM kind of mindset, they thought, actually, yeah, we didn't think of that. So we didn't have any software. So it was verbal communication, and we rolled it out very slowly on new projects. I liaised quite closely on projects during the design and construction phase just to make sure they were clear about the asset information requirements and the format that we needed it in. The second point, in terms of if there's a change to a building design, we didn't quite achieve that during my time at Skanska, but I was promoting soft landings, government soft landings, which is a process that's available where at each stage of the building life cycle, it's aligned with the REBA, I think 2013 at the time. So each stage of the building life cycle, there were these kind of checkpoints. And I looked at it from an FM point of view. So for example, when it came to design reviews, the recommendation is to have FM teams in those meetings to look to see where assets have been installed digitally in the 3D model, in the BIM model, and then for FM teams to say, actually, you haven't provided us with enough access to be able to go and check on those assets or repair those assets if they're broken. So these are like the soft clashes aspect. So that would have been really, really helpful. We kind of did it, but not in an official capacity. But soft landings is there to achieve that. So if there is a major change to a design, the checkpoint is that FM teams should be invited to those design reviews to say, actually, that's a health and safety issue if you put that asset there. We can't reach it. We don't have mobile, ladders to reach that asset.
Absolutely. And one thing is also very interesting to me because you are working in, again, Skanska. It's a huge company. So when you started implementing the asset information and you don't have any software that allows, much smoother transition. Obviously, at that time, I understand that also there were a lack of software and there weren't that many software as we have now. But the idea is like, how were you transferring the learning curve from one department to another department, or how would you spreading this conversation so it's as efficient as possible? How were you doing that?
Right. So I worked in tandem with a technology implementation lead that was also in the business. And in fact, he was the person who selected the core CAFM system that is used by the FM teams. And when it came to communicating what our information requirements were in the format, my colleague actually gave demonstrations of how the CAFM system worked so that design and construction teams could actually see visually, this is what happens to the asset register when you hand it over to us. This is how it's configured within our system. And these are the additional data fields that we expect our FM teams to fill in when they have to go and regularly maintain an asset, or if there's a breakdown with an asset. So we had to just basically educate them on, this is our way of working. This is what the data looks like in our systems. Conversely, the design and the construction teams were also teaching us about the 3D models, what's captured in the 3D model. We saw our information requirements captured in early designs, 3D designs. So it was good to get a visual representation of our information. And it was good for the design and construction teams to actually get a visual kind of idea of what our information looked like. And so there was a lot of collaboration, which was really, really good. It was really good because there was more joined up kind of thinking. Everybody was working towards the same goal. People started to appreciate the value of asset information far more. We started to break down a lot of silos as well.
That's awesome because People generally tend to not understand until they see it and need it in the right way. You just literally show them where your pain points are. So this is why you would need it. And they now understand, okay, we need a little bit more structured way so they can actually use and get the most out of the model after all this effort. Did you use BIM and asset management to the extent of digital twins?
Not that it could be defined as a digital twin. So I 2 years ago in another role, I had to research what digital twins were. And I think there's some kind of debate about digital twins at the moment, whether digital twin is just BIM, which it isn't. So the best explanation that I found about digital twin was it's a digital replica of a physical object that captures real-time information about that object. So if it was a case of a building, digital twin would be a digital replica of that building that's capturing real-time information about how that building is performing. So it could be occupancy levels at that a particular point in time. It could be temperature at a particular point in time, light intensity, oxygen levels, CO2 emissions. It could be anything you like, but it's giving you real-time information about how that building is performing. The benefits for facilities management are so many potential benefits. Can you imagine a maintenance engineer having a visual representation of a building that they're managing, and then you can just see on a screen, actually, the building's running okay, it's half occupancy, the oxygen levels are fine, the CO2 emissions are below, the agreed thresholds and so on. But that digital twin could also raise alerts to the engineer if an asset begins to show signs of early failure. And then that engineer can then go and visit the asset and make whatever repairs they can make. And that's condition-based monitoring. That's just in time monitoring, where you only have to go and visit that asset only when it starts to show signs of deterioration or potential breakdown. The cost benefits are significant because compared with the traditional way of planned preventative maintenance, or PPM, where it's scheduled maintenance, you're having to go and visit an asset and repair or maintain an asset, even if that asset is working perfectly well, as compared to condition-based monitoring, where you only need to visit that asset if that asset starts to show signs of failure, and a digital twin can actually be configured to raise an alert, and only raise that alert if that asset starts to show signs of failure. So the potentials are huge. What I'll say though is at Scanscale, there was a doctoral student, somebody doing their doctorate in BIM, who actually implemented a system, a condition-based monitoring system within one of the projects that we were managing. And as I said, it involved sensors, data capture, the data being captured into a data collection system. The data were being aggregated and processed and translated, and the information being interpreted, and it was being connected to a building monitoring system that if the performance of an asset went below an agreed threshold, it would raise an alarm, and it would be connected to a CAFM system. So a work process order would be raised. And at that point, the engineer could go and visit the asset. So I would say, actually, all credit to my ex-colleague who completed this doctorate. He had, he was involved in the early kind of makings of a digital model, a digital twin.
I mean, it is really interesting. And I would like to add to here a little, because digital twin, when we talk about it, there is a huge benefit, like you suggested, in the asset management side. But there's also two other sides which brings a lot of benefit. One is during the construction stage. So you can actually see loads of things that how the construction were, because your BIM model might be, depending on the obviously procurement you are going, your BIM model might be at a certain up to certain level of detail, and you submit it for the procurement. But the construction, there are certain changes going on. So these changes can be captured much efficiently in the BIM model. So it can be transferred to the asset team. and the right data, because obviously you do have, for example, piping in one way, and you just decide that the piping doesn't work in that way because you couldn't manage to order those particular components, or there might be lots of issues. So if the design changes are happening direct during the construction, or certain changes of because of construction methods, this way you can know that the model actually doesn't represent 100% of the real construction, where you can do some adjustments, and the asset asset management team will have a full idea. And I think also there's a huge benefit on the renovation side, because if you're doing a renovation to the building as an asset management team, you have to understand how this building was really performing, right? So when you know how it was performing for the last 10 years, your renovation decisions will be much more efficient. So you will know places there where they have been used mostly, the issues in where the issues were, like what kind of issues you had in this building, and what why the CO2 emissions were higher, or were good. And so you can take the right decisions for renovation in a particular way. So this is really interesting topic. I would like to talk a little bit about the standard. So when we talk about the standard, I mean, do you have familiarity with ISO 19650? It's very recent. I know that during the time where you were working with Skanska, you had maybe a standard of BIM from the UK saying BSI, because of the BIM mandate, and an ISO 55000 for the asset management. Can you speak a little about those portions?
Yeah, sure. So in my time, it was just before the ISO. So we were working with within the UK PAS 1192 series. For us in the facilities management division, it was PAS 1192 Part 3, which was the management of asset information during the operational phase of a building life cycle. And so everything that I tried to develop within the business in terms of improving the asset information quality, my aim was always to align it with the BIM framework, the PAS 1192 Part 3 framework, so that if we were ever audited, we would meet the criteria of what best practice was. So what I will also have to say, not only did we develop the asset information management platform, myself and my colleague who was the technical implementation lead, we developed an audit process to ensure that the quality of the asset information that was being added to during the operations phase remained a particular level of quality. So we would do a sample check of data from every project in the portfolio, and we used to check it and interrogate it to see if it met 10 criteria, and also the level of maturity of the systems being used to maintain the quality of the information. And if we found there were elements of information quality that fell below the threshold, we would create bespoke business plans, speak to the project teams and say, right, okay, between this audit and the next audit, you need to start implementing this. And then we will do another sample check of data. So everything that we did in terms of the new asset information management platform was always with PAS 1192 Part 3 in mind. And because I had an analytics background, and through my research of what facilities management was about and the value of asset information being captured, I always knew that information should be used for business improvement. And the most logical area is strategic or long-term asset management. And that's where I was also promoting the benefits of ISO 55000, which is the strategic asset management standard. So just to explain what asset management is, it's the coordinated activities of an organization to generate as much value from an asset. And an asset could be anything that an organization considers to be of value. So it's definitely your physical assets in the building. Information is definitely a valuable asset. Resources, people is an asset. So anything the organization deems to be of value can be termed as an asset. And so ISO 55000 is a standard which gives guidance on best practice to implement a really robust and effective asset management system, people, processes, technologies, and standards to generate as much value from an asset. So it could be a physical asset like an air handling unit. The objective is to make that air handling unit as valuable as possible in terms of its reliability, reduce as many breakdowns as you can, while it's being run in a building. The more reliable you can make that asset, the more valuable it is. It's valuable to the people who occupy that building. It's valuable to the life cycle fund managers because they don't have to spend as much money to repair it. And so the link between what's now ISO 19650 Part 3 and ISO 55000 is actually the definition of asset information. Asset information is the capture, the storage, the updating, the access of information, but it also includes how information is utilized. So ISO 19650 Part 3, how you manage that information during the operations phase. But the purpose is actually to use that information for something. You don't capture data for data's sake. You analyze that data to generate information so you could improve the way you run your operational activities.
Absolutely. Because otherwise data has no value if you cannot extract
value at all. Yeah. No value at all. You're supposed to capture it to use it for something. Absolutely. And so ISO 55000 relies on asset information in order to decide what is the best long-term strategy for managing an asset. How do we make this asset as valuable as it can be in the most cost-effective manner? That is the definition of asset management. You cannot achieve good strategic or long-term asset management without having good quality asset information to inform those decisions. Absolutely. And once I saw that link, I've been passionate about linking BIM with analytics, because you have to use analytics to generate information from your data. Correct. And strategic asset management. So I will thank the then MD back in 2009 who gave me the remit to be the BIM lead, because it allowed me to promote all three. They're all linked, and they're all linked by data. BIM, I regard BIM as a vehicle for capturing the information that you need to do something useful with it. Analytics to generate the data that's being captured, and strategic asset management to use data to make long-term decisions about how to generate as much value from your asset as you possibly can in a cost-effective way.
I think what we are speaking here is very important, and a lot of people, like the industry, most of the time neglect that information because they are really focusing on architecture, engineering, and construction side. But in reality, operation and maintenance is over 30 years life cycle. Is
absolutely
it spends much of the project costs. I think it's 60 to 30, like 65 to 35 ratio or something like that.
Something like that, if I remember rightly. Yeah, it's a huge amount, and to be able to feed lessons learned from the operational phase back at the front end of new projects. This is valuable information. And so we, within our area, I collaborated so much with my colleagues, the BIM leads from the design team and the BIM leads from the construction areas, just to share knowledge. And hopefully they learned something about how we work in FM, but I definitely learned a lot about how they work in design and construction.
I will do a little metaphor here, but back in time when I was studying bachelor, and there were some exams we were taking, and when you take the exam, you just get to see the results. Like you just get, for example, 70 out of 100, or 90 out of 100, or 80, whatever. But they're meaningless. They were meaningless to me because, okay, you see the number, but where did I do right and where did I do wrong?
Exactly.
You have no idea. And that is a huge minus from the educational side for me, because you don't learn and you don't improve. You can get 70, but
Exactly.
you might repeat the same mistakes of 30%. And why I would repeat the same mistake? So at the same time, I was like criticizing doing like education system, but it was the part of a bigger system which I couldn't change. But in the BIM world, you can do that. I mean, you can
Absolutely.
really learn where the mistakes were or where the like good decisions and bad decisions were, and feed that loop in the beginning of the project with the experience. And that way you don't repeat the same things and you just constantly improve. And that is the Toyota production system approach, right? So continuous improvement.
Absolutely. Have closed that loop. Close that loop.
It's a huge part of the project management as well. So which is a very important part. So before we end up and you give a few ideas about like do's and don'ts in BIM, which will be very interesting for sure. So the people, so the audience should stay until they listen to that. But I would like to ask a few other questions. What were the most interesting projects you worked on, and what were the biggest challenges on that project?
Okay. I would say that every project that I've worked on where I've been involved in BIM has been interesting, because I learn something new all the time. So at Skanska, I worked on buildings. So it was public sector and private sector buildings. The public sector covered education, healthcare, judicial, defence, commercial buildings, all sizes. And then when I moved into consultancy, I was looking at BIM in nuclear and aviation, and slight nuances, but there's always a consistency in terms of asset information. But it was very interesting to learn about how these different sectors work. But I have to say that it was my experience at Skanska, me staying for 8 years to see that project from the beginning all the way through to the end, from poor quality data, I've got to be honest, poor quality data through to good quality data. That was actually a really good experience for me, because I was able to roll my sleeves up and actually be responsible not only for the strategy, but also a lot of the implementation. I had the opportunity to collaborate with so many teams. So I worked with so many FM teams in different sectors. I worked with asset management, life cycle managers. I even collaborated with some of the clients, and then the design teams and the construction teams. And I'm somebody that loves to learn. You never know everything. The more you learn, the more there is to learn. So
The
I
more you
loved
don't know.
exactly. That's something I learned in my PhD, actually.
Yes.
I love the knowledge sharing. I suppose the project that was the biggest achievement for me was the Royal London Hospital in the UK, which at the time was the second largest hospital in the whole of Europe. And that was the first project where the new asset information management platform was deployed. And it was nice to see that rolled out. It was nice to see the tagging protocols that I had worked with FM teams to develop. It was nice to see that. I was given tours of the plant rooms, which were vast. So to see your barcoding tagging protocol on the massive air handling units was really kind of satisfying. It was the first time that the new standards had been deployed. It was the first project. I was working with the mobilization manager, who was really keen to see these standards. It took a while to develop the standards. And actually, one of the challenges that I had was because it takes time to design a suite of new information standards. And I was having to communicate about what was coming, but I didn't have anything tangible to show them at the time. I didn't want to show them something tangible, but then have to scrap that and then replace it with something new. So I was trying to balance how much communication to give about what was happening. So I found myself having to communicate something that was quite conceptual, which wasn't helpful to the to the teams who were waiting for those standards. The Royal London Hospital was the first project where those standards were deployed. And so it was really satisfying to actually see that in progress, see that in work, see the tagging of the assets in the huge plant rooms. And off the back of that, roll on, I think 18 months, because we had improved the quality of the asset information, we improved the quality of the processes. Mobile technology was also deployed across the whole portfolio of projects, where the maintenance engineers could remotely capture asset maintenance information and asset breakdown information remotely on handheld devices. And that couldn't have been achieved without having defined standards where everybody was working in a consistent way. So for me, working my BIM time at Skanska, it was challenging. I am not going to lie. There were some very, very challenging moments, but I have satisfaction in seeing a project through to completion in terms of having seen good quality information being captured, and being able to actually have discussions like this where I can give an end-to-end case study of this is what was the problem was, this is how we achieved it, the do's and don'ts of how to implement BIM in a facilities management environment.
That's really valuable asset in the end, I would say. And we will come in a second about giving some advice also to our audience, saying like do's and don'ts. But lastly, like I would like to make a point over there. It's a very big, very much gratitude, because when you do so much effort and you put so much strategy and difficult times and challenges of getting the standards and protocols in the right order, and seeing that this is applied effectively in a project, that's obviously I would call it a success, because you could just see that how your strategy changed so much in getting, in the end of the day, like how it was like worked in traditional means, and with your approach, with your strategy, and you see, wow, the data is now at a certain different level, and then now we can use that information and that knowledge a little bit back and use it for the next project. So that's really, really valuable. Okay, let's jump into the do's and don'ts with BIM.
Okay.
What would you suggest to our audience, like do's and don'ts? Maybe a few points for each would be great.
Right. The key do for me was to look at day-to-day operational issues that are causing real problems for your teams, and use BIM to either mitigate or eliminate those. Start on using BIM to address the issues that you currently have before you look at the aspirational elements of BIM. I would definitely promote that. And that's what we did back in 2009. There was an information quality issue, and we used the BIM framework to address those issues. That's the main BIM do, I would say. The BIM don'ts would be, don't deploy or implement sophisticated BIM technologies unless you are clear, unless the business is clear about the benefits it's going to bring.
This is very important.
You might have existing technologies in your business that just aren't being used properly, or just hasn't been configured properly, that can achieve what you want to achieve instead of buying something new. And we use that approach in FS. When we was looking at a new CAFM system, we actually looked to see how all the CAFM systems that we had in the portfolio at the time were performing, and we were looking to see whether could we just adopt one of these or just reconfigure it. The answer was no, but then we were justified to go then and select a new system. So always just be very clear about the cost benefits. Do a cost benefit analysis about the systems that you're looking to implement. Is it worth it? Is it going to achieve some real benefits like safety or cost savings? Just make sure you're clear on that. The second note would be for anybody that's implementing BIM for the first time, don't assume that BIM, the BIM framework, and I'm with particular focus on the process side of things, don't assume that BIM can be magically implemented in the organization without putting in some effort.
And it's not one fit for all. I mean,
No,
this is like it is specific to the organization, to the project, to the process, and more. And commenting on the first point, what you said, don't, it's very important to understand as well. Don't mix the traditional workflows with the BIM use unless it's really getting the right value for you. Generally, it will not. So you need to focus on getting the like what you want to get. And as Medina said, backwards engineer and what do you need to get there. So since you're used to use these software products or these processes, it may just block and make things even worse because BIM works in a different way. So it works with information management and sharing, and your traditional systems might actually block that. So be careful on those aspects as well.
absolutely. And I need to make a point about that as well. There were situations where a technology vendor would approach us about a particular BIM technology, but it was how they were promoting it would require us to shoehorn in a new technology that wouldn't complement our work processes. So actually another BIM do is to make sure that you are very clear on your back-end work processes so that your top technologies, you select the technologies that complement your processes that you have defined and
Absolutely.
not the other way around.
This is 100%. This is 100%. You just don't choose a vendor just because there's a vendor and software available. You build a strategy and process and you choose the right products, right technology based on your needs. Otherwise, you just stick to one vendor and that vendor might just stop producing new versions. They can bankrupt. Anything can happen. And the technology is all the time changing. So you need to focus on the process, as Medina has a very good point over here.
And the other don't, actually, to just follow on about the first don't in terms of don't assume that it's you could implement BIM without any planning. You need dedicated resource. It's going to take time to understand how your current business model works. Decisions have to be made about whether you want that business model to change. You need to have a look at all the back-end processes, map them out, see where the pinch points are. And it's at that point that you can see how BIM can support you in eliminating those pinch points. And you can't do that in tandem with your day-to-day job. You need to have dedicated resource to do that, who has the freedom to collaborate with as many teams as needed so they get a really good picture of how you work and what the issues are. And it takes time. So don't assume.
This is a message to the MD, I think. This is a message to MD, like top
time.
levels. Yeah.
Yes. So yes. Valuable lesson learned. It takes time. And the second note would be, don't expect to implement BIM without there being some degree of disruption to your existing ways of working. It's not going to happen. There will be disruption. And this is where one of my main primary kind of lessons from my experience has been the change management aspect. Designing new processes and standards and selected technologies, don't get me wrong, they were technically difficult at times, but I actually thrive on that. I enjoy that. It's the people management side of things that actually was the most difficult. So you have to take people on the journey with you. So you have to be very aware of the organizational landscape where you're trying to implement BIM. Don't underestimate how organizations' culture can affect how successful or how quickly you can implement BIM.
Absolutely.
And know your stakeholders, which is obvious, but know those stakeholders who have influence and support you, and embrace them. But also know your stakeholders who have a lot of influence but are resistant to change, because they really can impact how quickly you can deploy BIM in your organization. And consult, communicate, and collaborate.
Very well
And
said.
keep doing so.
Very well said. Now we will jump into the QA, and we are looking forward to your questions. We are really eager to answer them. So we will spend about 10-15 minutes on those questions. Just start populating them in. Thank you very much, Medina. It was great experience talking with you and getting deeper into asset and FM management with BIM. So I think this is very valuable knowledge, and I wish you excellent, better level of career in the near future.
Oh, thank you very much, Hassan. It was really, really nice chatting with you today.